Have you ever watched a storm rage while the mountain stands still? No matter how fierce the winds, the mountain remains unmoved, calm, steady, unshaken. Now, imagine that same stillness in an argument. The person who stays composed, who doesn't rush to defend themselves, always seems to have the upper hand. Why? Because control isn't about speaking more, it's about speaking wisely. Most people argue to be heard, not to understand. They repeat themselves, raise their voices, and desperately cling to their opinions. But the one who masters silence holds all the power. Think of a fire. The more air you give it, the stronger it burns. But take away the oxygen, and it dies out on its own. The same applies to arguments. When you stop feeding them with reactions, they lose their force. This is the power of strategic silence, a principle the Stoics lived by. When you refuse to be pulled into emotional battles, you shift the balance. The more they try to provoke you, the more they expose their own weakness. And in that moment, without saying much at all, you win. So, how do you turn silence into your greatest weapon? Stay until the end, because the last strategy will change everything. Let's begin. Number 1. Stay calm while they lose control. Imagine standing in the middle of a storm, winds howling, rain crashing down, yet you remain still, untouched, unshaken. Now, apply that same stillness to an argument. Most people think winning an argument is about having the sharpest words, the strongest facts, or the loudest voice. But the truth? Victory isn't about what you say. It's about how you carry yourself. When emotions take over, logic fades. And the moment someone starts arguing with feelings instead of reason, they've already lost ground. That's where your advantage begins. Your ability to stay calm exposes their lack of control. The louder they get, the more desperate they appear. The more frustrated they become, the less credible they seem. Their anger doesn't weaken you, it weakens them. And while they waste energy reacting, you observe, analyze, and wait. This is power. This is control. The Stoics understood this well. Marcus Aurelius once said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." Realize this, and you will find strength. You can't control how someone else behaves. You can't stop them from twisting your words, raising their voice, or trying to provoke you. But you can control how you respond. You can choose composure over chaos. You can let them unravel while you remain unmoved. And when you do, you don't just win the argument, you command respect. Let me share a story. A friend of mine, let's call him John, once found himself in a heated workplace debate. His colleague was furious, interrupting, accusing, trying to bait him into a reaction. But John, he didn't roll his eyes. He didn't scoff. He didn't rush to defend himself. He simply listened. And then, when his colleague had exhausted himself, John responded, calmly, precisely, without a hint of emotion. The result? Everyone in the room instinctively sided with him, not just because he had the stronger argument, though he did, but because he held himself with unwavering control while the other person looked irrational. That's the secret. The one who stays calm always holds the real power. Arguments aren't won by aggression, they're won by presence of mind. So the next time someone tries to drag you into their storm, don't fight it. Let them shout, let them fume, let them expose their own weakness, while you stand untouchable. Number 2, ask sharp questions instead of defending yourself. Imagine a swordsman in battle. A reckless fighter swings wildly, wasting energy on brute force. But a master doesn't need to clash steel against steel. He sidesteps, redirects, and lets his opponent's own momentum work against them. In an argument, words are weapons, and the sharpest tool at your disposal isn't defense, it's precision. Most people, when challenged, immediately jump to defend themselves. They explain, justify, and try to prove their point. But the moment you start defending, you've already surrendered control. You're playing their game, reacting to their attacks instead of making them question their own stance. A wiser approach? Ask sharp, pointed questions. Instead of fighting their argument head-on, turn it back on them. A weak position cannot hold under its own weight. Let them struggle to support it. The more they attempt to explain, the more their argument unravels. And the best part? You barely have to say anything at all. The Stoics mastered this art of restraint and strategy. Marcus Aurelius once said, "The nearer a man comes to a calm mind, the closer he is to strength." A composed, strategic thinker will always outmatch someone who argues emotionally. Instead of rushing into a back-and-forth battle, step back and shift the burden of proof onto them. If their reasoning is flawed, it will collapse under its own contradictions. Your job isn't to fight, it's to guide them to defeat themselves. Let me give you an example. A guy I know, let's call him Alex, was in a debate with a co-worker who dismissed his project idea as unrealistic. Instead of getting defensive, Alex simply asked, "What specifically makes you think it won't work?" His co-worker hesitated, then mentioned a minor issue. Alex followed up with, "And how is that different from challenges we've successfully handled before?" His co-worker fumbled, realizing he wasn't arguing from logic, just opposition. Within minutes he was backtracking, and Alex had won without ever needing to prove himself. That's the power of asking the right questions. So how do you apply this? First, stay calm. The more composed you are, the more control you hold. Second, ask precise, pointed questions. Make them explain themselves fully. You'll often find their argument is weaker than they realize. And finally, resist the urge to defend. Instead of justifying yourself, make them justify their position. At the end of the day, the person asking the questions controls the conversation. Arguments aren't won by shouting the loudest. They're won by making the other person realize their own mistakes. So let them talk, let them struggle, and let their own words work against them. Number 3, use silence to make them doubt themselves. Picture a battlefield where one warrior swings wildly, shouting, lunging, desperate to land a blow, while the other stands still, calm, unfazed. Which one truly holds the power? In arguments, words are weapons. But silence is the ultimate strategy. Most people believe winning a debate means talking more, proving more, responding to every point. But the truth, sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. Silence, when used with intent, isn't weakness. It's a psychological weapon that forces the other person to wrestle with their own thoughts. Here's the reality. Silence creates discomfort. When someone argues, they expect resistance. They expect you to push back, to meet their energy with equal force. But when you don't, when you simply remain calm, still, and say nothing, it leaves them with nothing to fight against. And that's when doubt creeps in. Suddenly, they start questioning themselves. Did I say something wrong? Do they know something I don't? Did I just weaken my own argument? That uncertainty, that's where you win. The Stoics understood this well. Epictetus once said, "Let silence be your goal, except when speaking is more valuable. Not every battle needs to be fought. Not every attack needs a response. Sometimes the most dominant move you can make is letting your silence speak for you." Because when you refuse to engage, you don't just avoid unnecessary conflict. You force the other person to confront their own insecurities, their own contradictions, their own weaknesses. Let me share a story. A guy I know, let's call him Daniel, was in a heated debate with a colleague who was determined to prove him wrong. The colleague kept throwing out arguments, talking over him, trying to provoke a reaction. But Daniel, he just listened. No interruptions, no counter-arguments, no frustration, just silence. And then something interesting happened. His colleague started repeating himself, filling in the gaps, justifying his own words, as if he needed Daniel's validation to believe what he was saying. And the more he spoke, the more obvious it became that he wasn't as sure of himself as he wanted to appear. By the time Daniel finally spoke, his colleague had already weakened his own position. That's the power of silence. So, how do you use this strategy effectively? First, resist the urge to respond immediately. When someone challenges you, pause. Let the silence settle. Let them feel it. Second, use steady eye contact. A calm, composed look can make them feel even more uncertain. And finally, watch them break under their own words. The more silence you allow, the more they'll scramble to fill it, often exposing their own weaknesses in the process. At the end of the day, silence is power. It unsettles. It forces them to doubt themselves. And most importantly, it puts you in control without you ever having to say a word. If you found this valuable, hit like and subscribe for more powerful insights. Number 4, agree with the truth, then redirect. Most people think winning an argument means countering every point the other person makes, but that only makes you seem defensive. A smarter way: acknowledge what's reasonable, then subtly steer the conversation in your favor. When you agree with part of their argument, it catches them off guard. They expect resistance, but instead you say, "That's a fair point," or "I see where you're coming from." Suddenly, the debate shifts from confrontation to conversation. Their defenses lower, making them more receptive to your perspective. Here's why this works. People argue because they want to be heard. When you validate a part of their argument, even slightly, they feel acknowledged. And once they feel heard, they stop pushing as hard. That's when you step in and redirect the discussion toward your position. Since you didn't reject everything outright, they become more willing to listen. Marcus Aurelius once said, "Be tolerant with others and strict with yourself." This means you don't have to prove yourself right at all costs. True strength isn't about rejecting every opposing view. It's about using agreement as a tool to lead the conversation where you want it to go. A friend of mine, let's call her Emma, once debated a co-worker about a project strategy. Her co-worker insisted on an approach Emma didn't fully agree with. Instead of pushing back immediately, she said, "You're right that efficiency is important, and I agree we need to streamline the process." That one sentence made her co-worker feel heard. Then she smoothly redirected. At the same time, we also need to maintain quality. What if we combine both approaches? What happened? Instead of arguing, the co-worker started seeing Emma as a collaborator. The conversation shifted from debate to problem solving, and by the end, he was agreeing with her. So, how do you apply this? First, find common ground. Even in difficult debates, there's usually some truth in what the other person is saying. Second, acknowledge it out loud. When people feel validated, they lower their defenses. And finally, redirect the conversation. Steer it toward your perspective while keeping them engaged. At the end of the day, agreeing with the truth doesn't mean surrendering. It means strategically leading the discussion. And that's how you win, without making it a fight. Number 5. Let them talk themselves into a corner. Imagine a fighter who defeats his opponent without throwing a single punch, just by letting them exhaust themselves. In arguments, the same strategy applies. The more you let someone talk, the more they expose their own contradictions. Most people feel the need to jump in, correct mistakes, and counter every point. But here's the truth. The more they speak, the more inconsistencies emerge. If you let them keep going, they will overextend, exaggerate, and eventually weaken their own position without you lifting a finger. People who argue emotionally or without solid reasoning often trap themselves. In their eagerness to prove a point, they throw out claims without thinking them through. And the more they talk, the harder it becomes to stay consistent. Eventually, they contradict themselves or expose the weak foundation of their argument. That's when you step in, not to attack, but to calmly highlight the flaws they created. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, once said, "Better to trip with the feet than with the tongue." A person who speaks carelessly will inevitably stumble over their own words. Your role? Stay quiet, listen carefully, and let them walk straight into their own mistakes. Let me give you an example. A guy I know, let's call him Ryan, was in a debate with a friend who was convinced that Ryan's business idea wouldn't work. Instead of defending himself, Ryan just asked, "Why do you think that? And can you explain more?" His friend kept talking until he contradicted himself. Ryan simply pointed it out. So, is the market too small, or is there too much competition? Because it can't be both. His friend realized his mistake, and the debate was over. So, next time, resist the urge to interrupt, listen carefully, and use simple questions to expose contradictions. Sometimes, the best way to win an argument is to say less, not more. If you found this valuable, drop a silent power in the comments and hit like and subscribe. Your support helps keep this channel going. Thank you. Number 6. Don't take their bait. Stay detached. Imagine a fisherman casting a hook, waiting for the fish to bite. The moment it does, the struggle begins. But what if the fish simply ignored the bait? No fight, no struggle, just calm indifference. In arguments, emotional traps work the same way. The only way they succeed is if you react. Emotional arguments are designed to pull you in, to get a reaction, make you lose control, and drag you into a battle on their terms. But here's the secret. If you refuse to react, you strip them of their power. When you stay calm and detached, their frustration grows, and their attempts to provoke you become useless. The truth is, people who argue emotionally aren't looking for logic. They're looking for control. They want you to match their energy, to get angry, to lose your composure. But the moment you take the bait, you've already lost. If instead you stay still, unshaken, unbothered, you turn the trap against them. They become frustrated, they expose their own irrationality, and in the end, they defeat themselves. Marcus Aurelius once said, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." You don't win by lowering yourself to their level. You don't need to meet anger with anger or match their aggression. Instead, you win by staying above it, by letting them waste their energy while you conserve yours. A friend of mine, let's call him David, once worked with a colleague who loved to provoke him. This colleague would raise his voice, throw sarcastic comments, and try to embarrass David in front of others. But David never reacted. He never raised his voice, never took the bait. Instead, he remained calm, responded with logic, and even smiled at the provocations. And you know what happened? The more David stayed detached, the angrier his colleague became, until he finally lost control and embarrassed himself. So how do you master this? First, recognize the bait. When someone is pushing your buttons, pause and remind yourself that it's a trap. Second, stay calm and detached. Respond with logic, not emotion. And finally, let them exhaust themselves. The more they try and fail to manipulate you, the weaker they look. At the end of the day, people who argue with emotion want to pull you into their storm. But you don't have to follow. Stay detached, stay calm, and let them drown in their own frustration. That's how you win, without even lifting a finger. Number 7. State your point. Briefly, then stop talking. Words are like arrows. The more precise they are, the harder they hit. Yet, most people believe that to win an argument, they must explain endlessly, prove their point over and over, and flood the conversation with words. But here's the truth. The stronger your argument, the fewer words you need. When you talk too much, you give your opponent more chances to twist your words, poke holes in your logic, or derail the conversation. But when you state your point clearly and then stop talking, you shift the burden onto them. They now have to find a counter-argument, struggle to refute you, and often they can't. Your silence forces them to think, and that's where the power lies. The Stoics understood this well. Epictetus once said, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it." In other words, you don't need to over-explain, over-justify, or beg for validation. When your argument is solid, let it stand on its own. Confident people don't feel the need to convince. They state the truth, and that's enough. A friend of mine, let's call him Daniel, once debated workplace efficiency with his boss. His boss kept making excuses for why a new system wouldn't work. Instead of arguing, Daniel simply said, "Let's run a 1-week trial. If it works, we keep it. If it doesn't, we go back. No risk." Then he stopped talking. The silence that followed made his boss uncomfortable. With nothing to argue against, his boss finally said, "Fine, let's try it." Daniel won, not by talking more, but by saying just enough. So how do you use this? First, make your point clear and direct. No fluff, no unnecessary words. Second, stop talking. Let your words settle. Let the silence do the work. And finally, hold your ground. When you don't feel the need to explain, you project confidence, and confidence is difficult to argue against. At the end of the day, the person who talks less often holds more power. While they scramble to counter you, you sit back, knowing your words were enough. Speak with confidence, then let them struggle with the silence. That's how you win. Number 8. Know when to walk away. Some battles aren't meant to be fought. Not everyone argues to seek truth. Some argue to feel superior, to waste your time, or to drag you into pointless debates. And when you engage with them, you're not winning, you're just giving them exactly what they want. Here's the truth. Sometimes the most powerful move is to leave them arguing with themselves. If someone refuses to listen, if they reject every perspective but their own, if they argue only to satisfy their ego, why waste your energy? The more you try to reason with them, the deeper you sink into their chaos. But when you walk away, you deny them the reaction they crave. And nothing frustrates a manipulative person more than being ignored. Epictetus once said, "It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows." If someone is convinced they have all the answers, no amount of logic will change their mind. So, why waste your breath? A wise person doesn't chase arguments that lead nowhere. Instead, They choose peace over pointless conflict. Let me share a story. A friend of mine, let's call him Jake, used to debate constantly with a co-worker who always had to be right. No matter the topic, this person would argue endlessly, not to learn, but to dominate the conversation. One day, in the middle of yet another pointless back and forth, Jake realized something. This wasn't a discussion, it was a game. So he did something different. Instead of continuing, he simply said, "You might be right," and walked away. And just like that, the argument ended. No fight, no validation, just an empty space where conflict was supposed to be. His co-worker was left speechless. Jake had won, not by proving himself, but by refusing to play the game. So how do you know when to walk away? First, ask yourself if the argument has a purpose. If they refuse to listen, there's no point in continuing. Second, consider their intentions. Are they seeking truth or just seeking control? And finally, remember that your peace is more valuable than their validation. You don't need to win every battle. Sometimes the real victory is choosing not to fight at all. At the end of the day, wise people don't argue to dominate, to prove others wrong, or to seek validation. They argue to understand, to refine their thinking, and most importantly, to know when to walk away. Not every battle is worth fighting, and true strength lies in choosing which ones deserve your energy. When you stay calm while others lose control, when you refuse to be pulled into pointless debates, and when you master the power of saying less, you don't just win arguments, you win control over yourself. The person who remains composed while others unravel always holds the real power. Silence, patience, and strategic detachment will often defeat loud words and emotional reactions. So, let them have the last word. Let them argue with themselves. Because in the end, the strongest move isn't proving you're right. It's proving you don't need to prove anything at all. That's what true confidence looks like. If this message resonated with you, hit like to support the channel, subscribe for more timeless wisdom, and comment "Silent Power" if you believe in the strength of restraint. And remember, mastering your emotions is the ultimate victory. The more you control yourself, the less anyone else can control you. Stay strong, stay mindful, and I'll see you in the next video, where we uncover even deeper strategies to help you become truly unshakable.